Okay, welcome. My name is David Pinto. I would like to spend 20 minutes or maybe an hour talking about Urb, which is the fiction, fantasy fiction or the science fiction or the psychological fiction or the science fantasy or whatever category it might be. It's quite unusual, but it is definitely a fiction. So it's a bunch of books. And I want to go through some of these books that I've written and describe them. Now, the purpose to this is, who is this for? And normally it's, I've developed this method where I'm integrating multiple systems, including the fact that you are living on your side and I'm just like a video being played. However, you're aware of reflexive reading or aware of other people that are watching this at the same time. And I think you're a writer. Okay, so let's propose that you're a writer. So the idea is that using Sqale is that people share stories, okay, through Sqale. So you might, for example, write a short story, and then you share it through Sqale, and then that finds your readership. People who like it share it with other people who might like it, and also it might also find other writers who want to collaborate with you on what it is that you're creating. Okay, so effectively end up with a kind of film script kind of team of people maybe working on something. I'm very interested in collaborative writing. And it also generates the revenue flow for it using Sqale. So we can pay for people to actually take part in these things. And it's episodic. So it's like the early days of Dickens, for example, who wrote a chapter, and then, or Orson Welles, H.G. Wells. And they wrote their chapter and then they wrote another thing straight away afterwards. And then, it's incremental. So we're kind of like this idea of episodic. Okay, so it really is being written and being shared, and the revenue flow is all happening simultaneously. Those things that are interesting to other people are shared more and quicker and so on and so forth. But also, as I say, it brings in more creativity. So it opens up a completely new genre of how we write collaboratively, creatively. A bit like Lost, I think it was the first TV series that did that on an ongoing kind of procedural basis. We'll be doing that maybe with other kind of writing, including what I've written. Now, so you might get an idea based on what I'm talking about that you think, oh, this is quite interesting. Or you read one of these stories and you're thinking, how does this work? And so that's the kind of person I'm interested in, is a person that is maybe interested in collaborating with me. And so this video contains spoilers, okay, for readers. The equivalent spoilers, perhaps, which would be contained in The Wall. Currently, The Wall by Cursus. And this is a collection of reports, I guess, by a chap called Cursus, who is, let's see who he is. This is The Binding. I thought it was the Blue Circle Binding. Anyway, the Blue Circle Binding, chronologue of the Venerable Sage Cursus of the Hazad, Meharim Exarch, specialist of Sangar Suexim, and it's the forethought by the Venerable Sage Cursus himself. And it has sections like on Orch, on Golem, politics of the time period, Meharim, kind of group of mathematicians, I guess. Guys, they are quite an interesting group. Not as interesting as the Assis. I think it's called the Assis. The glare, the phenomenon called the glare, which is kind of like a black hole, but a psychological version of it. Well, it's attractive. Onin and Other Worlds, that's actually us. Our Saviour Macus, introducing Macus. Whitestone, which is a certain type of Garceau, or a certain state of Garceau. Sickness, which is the kind of, I wouldn't say plague, but certainly the deterioration of the environment and the world and the living conditions. Money, I'm not sure why he's talking about money. Pneumathics, he's talking about pneumathics, okay, which is a new form of mathematics relative to them, which is called mathics, and that's kind of new to us. But Pneumathics for them is kind of our mathematics. So the limits of mathics and the wall. What is the wall? Oh, I think that the wall is a political strategy, a military strategy to deal with the orc. So all of that is by a guy called Cursus. So they're kind of like reports. And so there's a lots of spoilers in that regarding what the state of this world, Urb, is and how it's working. I could talk about a few of those things. The first thing I actually wrote about it was this, Adventure to Everdark. Pretty poor. It was meant to be a little adventure. It's pretty slow, not really much happens, and at the end of it, he dies. Apparently. Then there was basically a collection of material called the Book of Beginnings, The End of Civilization. This is meant to contain beginnings of stories, or the middles of stories, and the idea is that if people like the story, they write the next chapter. Collaboratively, perhaps with me, they take on a character and they think, oh, I know this character. This character is me. I don't have to write this. I can just be this, and I can kind of almost like role play what I would do given a circumstance. So if I create the circumstance, or other writers can create a circumstance, you as that character would just write your reply, or what it is that your character would say, i.e. what you would say in those conditions. That's the kind of potential that we're looking at. So the Book of Beginnings. Lessons in Mathics, which are an exploration of what mathics is. So young people are kind of sought out and discovered by these mathematicians called Merim, and they train them basically as adhurim. And if they qualify, i.e. they are skillful enough at the mathics, they become Merim and join the fraternity. And these are lessons, assorted lessons by different people describing different experiences they had with their students. There's another one called Assorted Urb, and I think that's just a collection of other threads that just don't fit into anything else. And so I think it's called Assorted Urb. This is the main one that I wrote after the Adventures to Everdark. Oh, by the way, it's called Adventures to Everdark because the planet rotates. It's like it's like a planet that is rotating. However, it's rotating with its axis pointing towards the sun. Okay, at an angle. Okay, so it means that there is, if it was straight at the sun and it's rotating, there would be a dark side. It never gets any light. That's the Everdark. Okay, so this is the sun side, and that's called the Everdark, the dark side. And it's a slight angle, so there's a little bit that is in daylight and has night. Okay, and the people who live there are called Twilighters. Okay, or twin-toned mind, and they are described as being very confused because they have day and night. Whereas the guys that live towards the center here, called the Solozo, are living in constant sunlight. Just the sun's constantly rotating around the sky. So they live in out in the open basically, but they live in these valleys, rift valleys, and in shade. But they have this constant light, and so their mentality is very strong and consistent. Whereas the people that have day and night, they're obviously very confused people. And what's living in the Everdark? Nobody wants to know. All right, so that's why it's an adventure to Everdark. Not pleasant things happen. This is the purple breeding. You can see that. It's in this ridiculous lighting. Purple breeding. There we go. And the purple breeding is a story which follows the narrative of Celeste, who. Okay, so let's have a read of the first introduction. And I think the introduction is a forethought. Okay, so it's the purple breeding. Almanac of the first Princess-elect, Celeste of family Adrienne. Forethought by the venerable sage Cursus of the Hazad, Meherim Exarch, specialist of the Sangarsu Aksin. So he gives a little foreword on her. For those interested in the future history of this world, or indeed any world, The life of Celeste deserves special attention. Her position offers a unique transversal from the on-the-ground Sqale practices and the outer reaches. The Sqale are a certain race of people that live on the outskirts, with a bunch of other ones actually, but specifically the Sqale here. So she's a Twilighter. So unique transversal from on-the-ground Sqale practices and the outer reaches to the current evolution of Faroim's sky city above the Urb capital. Her singular narrative of the Thousand Valleys region has a high temporal valency and cross-threaded with Barab, Ashitlan, and Torah, and outer rings Adukwe and Beredin, the inner ring Talouise, and the imperial ring of the Faroim, as well as the latest advantages of Garsu and Jax in all their denominations. Her story weaves a rich tapestry of the politics and culture of this crucial period. If you in history are placed at the juncture of critical events, you kind of get the idea of the flavour of this guy, Cursus. He's kind of like an academic. If you in history are placed at the juncture of critical events, and fewer still who are aware of their crucial responsibility. From reviewing this material, it will become clear to followers that Celeste's awareness can hardly be said to be of the greatest horizon. She is young. The beat of awareness is narrow. Like all of us, Celeste's life is a result of conscious choices made given her awareness at the time, contrasted with a far greater effect of non-conscious choices which result from the collective decision around her. That said, there is sufficient evidence in the Sangarsu thread to support the Lumen precept, that awareness expansion or contraction in the face of adversity is the single greatest factor which determines the fittingness of a person to their time. We ardently enthuse exploration of this, it's got a P there, but social nexus. So we ardently enthuse exploration of this social nexus to extrapolate the underlying generic psychosocial parameters and encourage sharing of the Sang-Aksim in order to invite serious collaborative synthesis. Then he goes on with 3 notices. Okay, and right. You're thinking, what? Now, we're in 12 minutes. It's probably not going to be 20 minutes. It might be, but we'll see. So the whole point about these fictions is that I've wanted to, over the years, because I went down the real path of engaging kids and trying to actually change the world in my own tiny little corner of the world, but try to improve the conditions of the world generally by inventing things that were fractal in nature. They worked with kids in classrooms, and if they worked with kids in classrooms and other kids in other classrooms with other adults, then perhaps across, I thought about the idea of scale across, not scale up and down, magnification and all these kinds of things. It's just about being real with a bunch of people and developing techniques that realness can be, I wouldn't say reproduced, but can be created in their own local conditions. And the result of all those local conditions is that we have a whole generation of kids, for example, in education, that are capable of working together collaboratively in a way that adults just can't, because we're kind of screwed up with money and positions and structures. Whereas kids in classrooms don't actually have that hierarchy. They've got soft hierarchy amongst themselves, who's popular, who's not, different groups and all this kind of stuff. But they're just kind of like soft interactions. And that kind of soft interactions is what I'm interested in. And how do we improve our ability to engage in these soft interactions, but in a way that actually is more widespread. Widespread again. See the language, how it kind of influences us. So the point about this fiction is to embed quite a lot of these thoughts and these experiences and these techniques and tools that I've developed in the real world into the virtual world. Okay, and I think that writing is like a virtual thing. So any kind of fiction and fantasy is like virtual. Okay, so this is just an extension of a virtual world. You're watching me, and I'm not a live person here. Well, I am on this side, but you're just looking at a video, and so it's just a virtual thing. You switch on, switch off. What we have to do is return to the fact that I'm actually a living human being, you're a living human being, everybody's watching this as a living human being. What are we doing about it? Okay, and fiction and fantasy has kind of taken over the world, from the original myths and storytellers to religions perhaps, to the Dream Factory, which was Hollywood, to the virtual world and the inventions we're creating in virtual worlds, computer games and so on and so forth, which is just beginning. And I think we're just about to, it's now December 2020, And the PlayStation 5 is just about to be released. Photo, realistic imagery at ludicrous rates, so you can't actually tell whether it's real or not, completely computer generated. And as the programming over the next few years develops in AI and so on and so forth, you won't be able to tell, if, for example, me talking right now, if I'm actually like a real human being talking here or I'm a fabrication. Okay, it's going to get very, very confusing. The virtual world is going to get very, very confusing for people, kids growing up in this environment. It's going to be mayhem. However, that's why I've developed various techniques to say, well, you're living now here. Okay, so that means that we need to develop a reflexive capacity to engage each other in appropriate ways so that we can improve basically the state of the world. Okay, so that when AI develops up to a certain level where it's actually talking and creating and it's kind of a separate identity, you know, we're not living in the ludicrous world that we're living in now, which is environmental degradation and economic and political strife. Okay, so we somehow or other sort out our global situation. Now, there's various techniques which I describe elsewhere. This one is specifically about urb, the fiction, i.e. the techniques, if once they start kind of like being used, will influence all kinds of things, including fantasy and fiction. What I'm attempting to do with these recordings is try to consolidate them all so that we can see, look, can we try and work together on this so that these are not just funny little techniques, one in economics, one in maths, one in education, one in, I don't know, spirit, you know, religion. We're not just using these funny techniques in funny little spaces, we're actually bringing them all together so that we can kind of really work well together in order to achieve, you know, phenomenal global results. Now, we don't have to dream about those things. In fact, that's what the fiction is. It's probably the closest to a dream. Okay, so I've never been one for creating kind of like visions for people. I think we're all capable of producing our own visions, and some of us are better than others. Fine, but that shouldn't be the visionary. Should not be the he's not an architect. He's just a visionary. He's like more like an artist, an inspired person. But actually, how do we achieve these, you know, ideal worlds, whether they're religious leaders or, you know, business leaders, whatever? You know, we need people to actually construct these things and to move forwards, to act them. And when we're talking about psychosocial dynamics, it's to do with each one of us actually doing our bit and learning how do we go forwards. Okay, there's no real experts in this. Okay, at least the path that I'm describing. So the whole point about urb. So that's kind of like the background. So it does rely on a few things. So there's a thing called reflexive reading, where when you're reading a text, you're actually aware that the person's writing it. Now, the I can't remember what it's called. It's called the McGibbons. I can't remember what it's called. All right, MacGuff. It's a thing that nobody really explains and understands, but it does a certain thing, and it's necessary for everything else to work out in a story. And I think, who is that? Film writer who kind of came up with this? Alfred Hitchcock, I think it was. And I think it was McGubbins. It wasn't McGubbins, but it was something like that. Something. We'll call it MacGuffins. All right, and within the fantasy, it's this thing called Garsu. Okay, and that was the one thing I've been wanting for like 10 years to get away from the real world, because basically that's quite a challenge to change any of that, even if you come up with results. Trying to get other people to pay attention is a nightmare. So I was like, oh God, can I just come up with fantasy? And the first time I tried that, got nowhere. 10 years later, I was like, oh, I really would like to get some fantasy. Nope, nothing. But then at the end of, you know, an unfortunate business opportunity thing, well, Sqale actually, the development of Sqale, in fact, the version before that, basically went bankrupt. I came up with this idea, the idea of Garsu. And again, okay, so these are involve spoilers. So from here on in, you've got a general idea, but if you don't want to spoil it, you just want to read some stuff and kind of enjoy the discovery of it and the exploration of it. That's the point about this, it's the exploration. I'm giving you a little jump ahead, you know, there's material there in which you can piece this together, but I'm a bit like Cursus, describing what the situation is. So I'm going to work out who's actually, you know, I'm actually thinking of when I'm describing this. It might be my brother, because he's a fantasy writer too, but I don't know, he isn't quite like what I do. So, but it might occur. because he's an incredibly imaginative person. He's written a whole world which is absolutely phenomenal, and I have absolutely no doubt that at some point in the future the material that he's created, but the world, maybe not the specific storyline will be made into a film, but definitely the world that he's created will be used for the creation of a digital world, fantasy world, game or films. Okay, incredible work what he's produced for years, 30 years of his life, more. Devoted, incredible. And I'm just producing a kind of like a little version which is quite thin, all right, but quite expansive, and it's got some depth to it, but it's not the density of solidity, the pointillism that my brother has come up with. Check it out, actually. I might put some kind of advert here for his work. But what I wanted to do with, I didn't want to do it, poof, this thing, Garsu, and it's to do with, it's a crystal that they mine, they discovered, that accentuates thought and allows people, once they perform a certain form of thinking or mathematics in this world called mathics, it can exaggerate, accentuate and project thought through it into other people's heads, okay? And also reflect upon it in their own. So if, for example, we had a little Garsu, so I even have, okay, I'm going to get a little stone. It's not really a stone. But I found this. It's a little bit. I found this in the garden the other day. We have extensive gardens around here, and it's from a long time ago. It's not even the kind of marbles that I had when I was a kid, and I'm pretty old. So we're talking maybe more than 50 years old, maybe 80, maybe 100. So if this was a Garsu, this is a large Garsu crystal, okay, if it was. And basically what it does, as far as I've been able to work out, is it is sensitive to mental projections. And so once a certain mathematics is performed on it, it can perform certain functions. Okay, so when it's in its rough form, like this, and dug out of the ground, it doesn't do anything really, it's still inert, but it can be kind of activated, and then it can have certain functions depending on the mathics that's performed. And one of them is sang aksim, which is the kind of recording. Okay, it's the recording of psychic reality. So that's instrumental in this particular book. It's what Cursus is using. So Cursus is then getting the Garsu and then reliving the experience of people around that stone. In this case, it's Celeste. So that's what it is. I mean, that's their initial idea, all right? And then the entire world kind of like exploded from that point. Now, I'm going to go into it a little bit. The objective, however, is, the objective is to create a realistic world, okay, that people enjoy entering into and flesh out and participate in. Books, short stories, films, computer games, whatever, doesn't really matter. And just enjoy the participation in this alternative world. However, there's a parallel to our current world. And the idea is that our participation and our investment in the reading and the writing and the creating of the narratives in this world, it's a bit like a sandbox where we get to play in it, okay, in order to test ideas that we're actually trying in the real world. So I'm inserting in this fantasy world certain ideas that people are going to be performing in the real world. So for example, the Sqale economic to do with sharing. So this video that you received is from somebody and you've received money. And that mechanism is contained in the books somewhere, actually, because as far as I know yet, I think it's only mentioned somewhere, but it's not actually being part of any kind of plot line. It would be really nice if there was like for example, the book of beginnings, there was a little short story, and in that short story it had this idea of sharing and money going forwards in time and all the beautiful things that Sqale is. And it's instrumental to the effect, the result of the short story. That would be cool. Okay, so if anybody can do that, that would be great. Now I haven't been able to do that, so it's just in the background somebody relates to in some city that are playing around with this kind of thing. But I did have a character who had a conversation with Celeste, but it didn't end up in the final book. But it was such a kind of like funny little thing just to stick in there. And if you look at it, my stuff's really pretty bad. Okay, pretty bad. It's just conversations mostly. I'm not really a writer. Okay, but the world is just amazing. So if we can, I'm just trying to indicate there's richness in here. And if people would take part in joining in and creating it, I think we can, much more creative and brilliant people than me in fiction might be able to develop something which is quite strong. So the idea is that the Garsu, so there are a whole bunch of people. Shall I go into the world? Okay, I haven't thought about this for a while. I probably should have made a note of it, written it up somewhere. This is the first version of trying to record the different systems. This one's called Herb. Okay, I just wanted to practice, as it were. This is kind of like a practice run. And, okay, so at some point or other, as far as I know, okay, these people discovered it, I don't know, thousands of years ago. And they were the Hazad. Okay, they were just wandering kind of tribes people in the Sunside. And they discovered some of these crystals lying on the ground, on the surface, in certain places. And then they started developing the mathematics, okay, and started to use it. And some of them, once they got relatively successful at it, became sedentary, and they became, they developed a kind of more formal structure called the Meharim, who are people who, the Brotherhood as it were, who can perform the mathematics to utilize this. However, they were kind of subjugated, they kind of helped, but then self-subjugated in a weird kind of way with these people called the Solozo. And the Solozo basically brought unity not only to the people, the tribes of the Solozo, but also every other. They became an empire and they basically conquered the entire world. And the Sqale the Sqale and the Roan, the Agrahal and the Zu, okay? And they're all Twilighters, okay? So the Solozo are people that live on Sunside exclusively, so they've got this kind of solid world life view of constant presence, whereas all the Twilighters kind of have day and night and kind of sleep. I'm not even sure what the sleep pattern of a Solozo is, but their interaction with reality is just slightly different. So in our world, we think the Solozo are unusual. So most of these stories are created in the Twilighter zone because they refer to our kind of world of day and night and use that kind of language, and they're kind of like us. However, the Solozo are not like us, okay? So they're kind of like the alien race. However, the Solozo think that we, the Twilighters, are like the crazy people, okay? And they brought peace to the unsettled mind and the instability of the Twilighters. Do you see the reflection? Could there be a reflection here in our society and how it is that we control ourselves and how confused we are and instabilities and all kinds, all right? So the Solozo have got some form of solution. Anyway, they managed to get the Hazad, basically they wiped out the Hazad, and the Hazad no longer is a tribe, and it's just, they're just Meharim, okay? So it's another kind of racial type, but they only exist as Meharim, as this kind of brotherhood. This happened quite a while ago, and this happened over periods. It's been an empire for at least 300 years, several thousand years, but the empire has a stable thing for the last 300 years, I think it is. And then they get to this point of narrative where basically they started mining more and more of this stuff, and now they've got to the point of the mathematics development that the Solozo in the homeland, under the ever-giving presence of the ever-giving and the Faroim, are basically going a bit bonkers, okay, because they're creating worlds, all right? They're creating, cities in the sky, literally living in cities in the sky, okay, through Garsu. And they're eating incredible delicacies and so on and so forth, but they're actually not real. And they're living just completely different life forms, okay? They're just starting to go off into La La Land. And that's the hub, that's the center of the empire, and they've got to that level. And the Meharim have got this kind of problem because these are their masters, and they're providing all these services, this incredible entertainment and services, but they're kind of disappearing into themselves. And the Meharim, that's not really what they're interested in. What they're interested in, okay, so that great big spoiler coming up, is that they've kind of predicted right from the beginning that if the Mathics got so good, and there's a Mathix called Atarax, and this Mathix, Atarax, is self-developing. So basically, they've got to certain levels and stages of this. Okay, just in the same way they've got to certain levels of projection, so they can make a few illusions, a few lights, and then it's like, oh, human-like forms and shapes and so on and so forth. And then it's like, wow, this thing is actually, I can feel it, and look, you can touch. You can touch these things. It's apparently real. To the point where people are actually imagining that they're actually moving around in these virtual kind of like beings. Okay, so the Mathix of Rax is quite developed. The Mathix of Atarax is kind of a self-contained little thing. It doesn't require a human being. It's not by a human being on another human being. It's kind of just creating itself and then projecting it to other people's minds. Okay, so this is called an Atarax. There's different levels to the development of that, and they're starting to get to the point. Well, they got to the point where you got like some aspects of this Atarax work like wards, okay, or like charms. They kind of affect people in certain ways, but they're not, there's no volition to them, and they're getting very close to this point where an Atarax. Hello? Okay. Is getting to the point where it's got volition, okay, and it's acting on itself as if it's like an animal or a creature of some kind. Anyway, and so the Meharim are aware that this is their kind of trajectory, and it's to create something which is self-conscious, okay, which is bona fide self-conscious, but it's contained within Garsu. And they call this entity Macus, actually Macus, and they kind of pray to Macus. Now, because this Mathix is a kind of psycho-social mathematics, it's something that's performed in the mind. It's like the Twilighters think that they're mages, they're magicians, and they call them magicians. And the Meharim don't mind the Twilighters because they're confused, call them magicians. They're not magicians, they're engineers of the mind. And what they're trying to engineer is effectively this Macus, because the Solos are kind of disappearing into themselves. There's this kind of sickness happening in the world, and they're trying to work it with eyes, but they're not particularly interested in the real world. They're more just interested in the kind of virtual. They don't really have control of maths and engineering of the real world. It's quite almost like primitive or medieval, I guess. That's the level it's got to. So they're wanting to develop this thing, and they're some people are closer than others, and others are pursuing. There's a guy called Grad Hacker who has been exiled because he started to produce. Okay, I'm laughing because it's all kind of, it's all invented, of course, but it's quite amusing that these things I'm talking about as if it exists. And this is the point, okay, this is what we do with fantasies and films and everything else, and it's kind of what we have to. You have to invest enough for it to be kind of real enough that we can narrate about it, but there are aspects of it, it performs a certain function regarding our current global social situation. Okay, so kind of try to remember that while we're kind of listening to this and kind of guess what you think the reflection is in our state of world. And that's the play that I'm interested in, okay? So, right, so the Grad Hacker, he did experiments on people where he was trying to recreate Atarax kind of in people's minds. Okay, so a kind of a version, manipulating mind in such a way that damaged people, but they kind of, I wouldn't say fused, just conducted experiments that were not particularly ethical on human beings, okay, such that these human beings were quite damaged. Anyway, he got exiled for this, and ejected out of the Meharim. In fact, I think they were planning to kill him, but he escaped. So then they said, well, he's exiled, because they basically track him down. And this guy set up shop in Sqale, in Ashland, where most of this stuff happens. Okay, most of the Twilighters narratives happen in a district called Ashland, and they're Sqale. And he set up a little, basically a tower, and he lives there, and he's basically surrounded himself with various forms of atarax. But he's also produced these kinds of human beings that are living but not undead, because they haven't died. They're unliving. And so they're physical embodiments, but they're operating a kind of atarax, so they're not really fully conscious human beings. And there's a thing called the Black Pilgrimage, where people, for whatever reason, I'm not sure how this started, but they all start going towards him and towards his tower and his district, his region, because he kind of promises an escape. For some people, it's an escape from the world that they're living in. So quite a lot of old people and cripples and diseased people and dying people go. And it's not to live forever, it's to die or enter into this unliving state, to release them from the suffering, okay, that they're experiencing. Other people are actually going there with some kind of hope that they're going to, this is a kind of better form of living. And so it's called the Black Pilgrimage. And so he's called the Dark Lord. But again, this is all just Twilighter talk, and they don't understand what's going on. And so there's an ambivalence as to what this thing is, and it's not great. And so there are, guards and so on and so forth that are unliving and operating kind of like guards, but in a, very minimal way. And other ones are just servants, or other ones are just labourers. So it's a very kind of sordid setup around Gradhacker, the Dark Lord, and the Black Pilgrimages that are going. There's a couple of stories, relating to that. People getting either trying to go in there. There's a couple of people trying to go in there to basically kill him, sent by the Meharim. Other people are there to try and rob from him. Other people are going there because they're part of the Black Pilgrimage and they're just wanting to find release. So there's an old woman. Can't remember her name. Old woman. Beginnings. I'll never find it because I don't have even a contents page. I haven't even got that level. By the way, if you know anybody, shaman. Oh, they're interesting. If you know anybody that actually might be, an artist, it'd be really nice to have some book covers. So if you read anything and you go, this is interesting, let's share this with somebody else who might enjoy the read. You might also want to share it with somebody that you might think might be a good artist and might want to draw or write or a character, and that's how the thing will kind of grow. It's participatory. Okay, so old lady, I can't remember her name. Maya, could be Maya. Right. Then there are other. So now what happened? With these guys, because none of this, this thing was all made up as we were going along. But the adventures to Everdark, basically this kind of happened, 30 years before this happened, the purple breeding. And these guys basically accidentally stumbled across, they were trying to look for some treasure or something, and, adventurers, and they stumbled across, they broke into some tomb, and they released certain things that they probably shouldn't have, and which altered them. But the way they went to basically the edge of Everdark, and there's the place, was it something of the dead, Valley of the Dead, and then they went to this special place, a cave, and they went into it to look for something, money, I guess, but they kind of accidentally released something. There's like some kind of guard or a ward going on in that area, which kind of contains it, but they accidentally released it. Or one of the people that kind of survived that experience kind of managed to escape. And because they managed to escape, they became the vector for this flow from the Everdark, that had been kind of sealed. And that, over the last 30 years, has created and expanded, multiplied. No, it's basically just a gateway, because this other thing that's been happening, the Everdark, Okay. As far as curses, various people, different people have different perspectives because, the technology for communication is not that advanced. They're trying to look for the greatest repository of this stuff, Garsu, and they've called it the Blue Mountain. That's what they've been trying to do. Some of these stories talk about cards trying to find that. And it's meant to be the size of, it's called the Blue Mountain. So the heart stone of the mountain is Garsu. And if they find that quantity of Garsu, it enables them to perform some ludicrous levels of mathics, which means that they kind of communicate instantaneously and various things can actually happen. It'll be like a massive upgrade. And so they don't actually find, well, anyway, I'm not going to reveal anything about that. Where were we? Right, so Garsu, trying to find the Garsu, the point of the Garsu. Oh yes, and over the years, while people have been performing little bits of mathics on this stuff, what's happened is that in order to make it kind of safe for people, they've had to perform certain functions to prevent people going mad or releasing, let's say, animal urges or the id in our twilighters, especially twilighters, because twilighters are not in control of what's going on of their minds. So in order to perform these functions, they have to perform certain mathics, and they didn't realize, it seems, that they were not stifling certain psychological entities and actions that exist within us, but they kind of released them. Okay, a bit like vapor. Okay, and that kind of escaped and somehow or others collected in certain places in the world. Basically, the dark side, the ever dark, and that has been manifesting and self-organizing, and certain forms have started to develop. Okay, that are kind of like the equivalent of Atarax, and in fact, some Meharim are actually sent, or Aduharim, to find and capture these more sophisticated Atarax that are kind of in the wild, okay? And then, to bring them back and study them, and hopefully understand what the mathics is, and then control it, all right? However, these entities have got a little bit more sophisticated, and they've got to the point where some of them have got volition and even self-consciousness, to different degrees. And because the basic material are these qualities of human beings that are not particularly pleasant or nice, or maybe like animal, so generally they're called Orch. Okay, the generic term is Orch, and and so any kind of creatures, and they've started to appear, more recently. We're talking about kind of goblins or stories of trolls and giants, and these entities, people talk about it, but these appear to exist, okay, and more of them are appearing, and so the Orch are basically manifesting, and the people that are living in the Twilighter area are starting to get a little bit pressured away from the dark side, from the Everdark. And anyway, so these guys that went to the adventure to Everdark, to the Valley of the Dead, accidentally created a little bit more of a gateway, okay, and kind of manifested it more. And one of the events that happened while Celeste is having her kind of like it's not really an adventure. In the background, there's this thing called the Overcast. No, it was originally called the Overcast. Became known as. No, I can't remember what it's called. Do I have a contents page to have a look at that title? No, I don't. Okay. So basic it is. So what happens is that there was a cloud, kind of came out of the west, dark cloud, and everything that was basically within it or underneath it, shadowed by it, was basically exaggerated these aspects that are within people. that are not particularly pleasant. Basically, people went a bit mad. And it goes over a city called Bizapo, I think it is. Bizapo. And the people there basically just start killing each other. You know, sons killing fathers, friends killing each other, you know, fighting each other, you know, jealousy, just irrepressible emotions and feelings that are not particularly pleasant. Greed, jealousy, and hatred, and acting them out. And basically, you know, overnight they just, you know, decimate each other, and they recover from it. Okay, they're just like, what the hell was that? As the cloud passes over and continues going towards the sun side, that kind of dissipates. But that's kind of like the initial forewarning of what is to come. And so the Meharim are like, wait a minute, they're a lot more organized than, you know, what's going on? This is way too powerful. So so they're in a chase, basically. So we've got the sickness, where the world's kind of deteriorating environmentally for some reason. And that's, again, through this. And there's like a material thing that occurs as resulting from this. There's a material, like smoke, that comes off of this at a tiny, micro, like atomic, you know, subatomic level, okay? Quantum level. And that's what's kind of affecting and polluting the kind of the biological world. So there's this kind of psychological disorder, and then there's this kind of like physical disorder that's occurring. And the Meharim have, they're overwhelmed by this. Or in fact, they don't really care about the sickness, but they're aware of the orc, and they're like, that's not so good. And so they think that once they develop the atarax for Macus will be able to solve these problems. So, you know, there are a few Meharim, the exarchs, a couple of them, and a few radicals like Gradacker, who believe that they have the capacity to resolve these problems. However, most Meharim don't think they do, and so therefore they're working collaboratively on trying to create this Macus, effectively God, to basically liberate them, and save them, and bring it all together, you know, solve all their problems, basically, the Solozu and Meharim and, you know, the Twilighters, the fools that are the Twilighters, the deluded folk, the Twilighters. So, all this is happening, and it's uncertain as to what's going to happen. And this, okay, and there's a few characters, and there's a guy, in fact, he was actually in this one, okay, Ubarak, and he's one of the lords, Soloza lords, that happens to be interested in the Twilighters. Nobody else is, all right? Soloza are not interested in the Twilighters, but he was, and he'd take trips, virtually, using Garsu, racks. He'd kind of project. And his vizier, his mage, the Twilighters would call him, the person who performs the mathics for him, basically enabled him to have these trips into, you know, for example, adventure to Everdark. To basically he was just fascinated by their minds, and this twin-tone mind, and he thought it was the future. Turns out he's kind of right. And he interacts with Celeste, okay, in this bit, you know, quite a bit later. And he kind of started this thing, you know, the opening of this gateway. But he's aware. He's also aware of something else, and there's a few other characters that are aware of other entities. Okay, now these other entities that are in existence are not obvious. Okay, although there are some other. I've come up with some other narratives that are kind of, you know, like angels. Somebody call them angels, guardian angels, and there are some creatures that are big enough that they kind of fly. They fly. Okay, so the people in this community and culture and world, they go birding. They don't go fishing. They go birding. So they go out and capture birds, basically. And these birds, are, you know, whole, you know, different large. You've got, you know, birds that are the size of like whales. Okay, far east in the sun side. But there's also certain things that are very high level, kind of like clouds, but they're actually physical, and I don't talk about those. I haven't really explored those, but I think I've written a fiction at some point in the past where there are these things in existence, and conscious beings live in these. I wouldn't call them clouds, trees, very high level trees. I think Larry Niven came up with integral trees, a bit like that. And so, right, so people, like for example, this guy Ubarak, and are aware that there are these other entities that are observing them. Okay, so for example, right now you're observing me. Now you're aware that there are other people watching at the same moment that I'm talking and you're kind of listening. Everybody else is at the same moment listening, relative to watching this video. Okay, not chronological time. Have a look at reflexive reading when I get onto that. But similarly, when you're reading at the same time that everybody else is reading at that moment that the same person is writing, me, in the case of the original books. But and there's something about that dynamic, okay, which we're exploiting, and that's what they're sensitive to. Okay, so you as the reader are aware of these other people watching this, and that's what the characters are aware of. Okay, and it's they have different ideas of what it is, as I say. And so one of the terms that they've come up with, I would call it common knowledge, but onen, okay, onen, and they call it onen, which is this kind of presence that is observing them and maybe controlling them, okay, to an extent. People might call them gods, okay, that would be the kind of our language for, the Greeks, Romans, gods. And so these characters, what I'm interested in is making them more aware of their context, such that they start to operate in certain ways that influence the observers. Okay, they own it. Okay, and so they're interacting with characters. So Ubarak engages Celeste, and does so in a way, and the language in the script, when you read it the first time, you're like, what? What's this? And Celeste is also, oh, what's this? Oh, it's like when she talks to Zala, her original coach, or who's a magician or a mage. It's actually Meharim, who kind of taught her a few things about metacognition when she was like an adolescent. And so when she meets Ubarak, it has a similar kind of thing going on, even though Ubarak doesn't really perform the mathics, because he's had a lifetime of engagement with his vizier, and he's interested in the racks, the development of the psychosocial dynamic mentally, and he's interested in the kind of the mentality of the Twilighters. He has this interesting conversation with her, but also with Onan, who are present. And has he been involved in her life up to that point? And she doesn't quite know, and she thinks that maybe he has. And so you've all got this, and I've seen a few films now where we're starting to talk about realities and how do we interact with our different versions of reality. And that's what this book's about. Not about, this is what it is, it's exploring, but getting us involved a bit more as writers and distributors and readers and writers and editors and games makers and filmmakers, but we're all doing it in a interesting, more, because of the financial system with Sqale, it means that we're kind of growing, and things are growing and developing, and the stories and the narratives and structures and the actual products, the outputs are forming at the rate at which they can. Okay, whereas in our current world, we've got, people who've got the money invest in directors who have already established themselves, and so it's quite difficult for people to kind of start developing in these environments and get the money required. And a lot of people make money out of it rather than let's just see where this goes and see what works and then grow from there. Much more self-organized and self-developing, and we'll see if. And so that's what Urb is about: is can we develop this kind of rich fantasy world in such a way that the process by which people get together is reflected in the text. So if you like a story, I haven't done this yet because I've created these kind of background stories, but I call them seed crystals, fractal seed crystals, and they're short stories, but they're really concentrated and they've got some interesting things about them that if somebody likes them, they share them. But they also might know other writers or people that want to write, and they collaborate and we write the next bit, or they do, or different versions might appear. But the point is, there are different directions that the plot might take, different characters, and the ones that are written and the ones that are shared will determine the success, or how successful and how long and how rich that narrative will be. So if you have two characters and they interact and they kind of separate, but there's a contention between them, and one of them is good and the other one's not so good, and the one that's not so good is shared a lot, and the one that's good only gets a few shares, in reality what's happening is that the one that's not so good is successful. The narrative, the numbers of people watching, the more writers, the more money, and so on and so forth. And so the action of what it is that we like and read and what we choose to share becomes the thing. Okay? It actually manifests in the real world in terms of money flow and people's interests and outputs, films, short stories, books, whatever. Do you see? And so, and that's what's happening in the current world. But it's almost just like separated from the real world of, I don't know, eating and building and jobs. Okay? And then we have entertainment and fiction, which also have jobs, but it's a slightly different thing. So we're kind of mixing all that up. And that's what the books and the stories and the narratives play around with. It's this kind of interface of who we are, what we're doing in the real world, and this fantasy world. And it's got these ideas that reflect in some form or other what we're doing. And there will be characters, for example, coming together in small groups and doing the equivalent of like experiential nights, or action cycles. That's what I call them in the real world. And there's correlations between the mathix and XQ. There's a bit of a correlation somewhere in there. How much, I don't know. And the whole thing about spirit and who we are, how we interact, kind of about the religion. Okay, so it's like a sandbox for these ideas and processes that we can kind of try out and practice mentally just by reading it. And then there might be one or two techniques that you go, wow, that's actually a really interesting technique. I'm going to try that with people. I'm going to try and engage people and think that actually we're all part of the same global family. What an interesting kind of notion. And does that alter how I interact with them? Or for example, actually at some point or other this is going to be immersed in my language, but it's not quite yet. But you know what I mean. And you, and the use of you is different. I'm sitting in front of this thing because I meant to make use of it. I should have put up a few of these words so it's not just me talking. Hopefully I'll get better at that. But, you know what I mean. Oh, you won't be able to see that, but you know, okay? What is you? Okay, and there are kind of interesting variations so that when we're actually talking with each other and we say the word you, we're not referring to Y-O-U, small, or multiple U. We're talking about something else, okay? And if we start to adopt that, without even people knowing, psychologically, just the function of that, and if other people do know, then that's interesting too. And and if that's connected to how it is that we engage socially, collectively as a unity, okay, then I don't know, it'll just be interesting, okay? So there are psychological games and activities. There's the actual act economically of sharing it through Sqale. There's different techniques that are maybe demonstrated by characters and how they engage socially, which people might want to try out. There's the whole thing about the mathematics being about the psychosocial mathematics rather than mathematics about things, what these guys call new mathics. The process of actually reading and influencing our culture and empowering ourselves as individuals, but more importantly, collectively, amongst ourselves. So it's not just individuals, but it's collectives of individuals, but not as bounded entities or groups, bounded companies, blah blah blah, and having exclusiveness. So it's a matter of getting a kind of, real tribal engagement between everybody on this planet. Which I think is what the Solozo brought, okay? Although, they're kind of like the bad guys so far, but I'm not convinced that they are. And anyway, so we're at 1 hour, okay, done quite well. So the idea is that this is the first part. I've described the first part of this period. And the idea is we write all that, flesh it out, have fun, and then if that works, great, it moves on. If it doesn't, maybe I'll come back, like in 10 years, 15 years, I don't know, 10 years maybe, and maybe write something else, okay? And it's like, what's happened in that time period in the virtual world? What's happened in our real world? Technology has progressed. Where are we with AI, that kind of thing? And where are we with our social engagements? And, we're inputting into them. Can we start making use, maybe in 10 years' time, people will start realizing, wait a minute, we can use fictional text more actively, socially, to communicate certain things and bring us together and try different things out. And so the actual narrative of what's happening in the world, and I suspect it's going to go into Solozo. We'll follow the narratives into the Solozo, into the Sunside. But we'll find out, because that's where Celeste is going, because she's meant to be married to the Faroe, to produce an heir. Okay, so that's meant to be the next bit in about 10 years' time, I would have thought. So we've got plenty of time to work on this. So if this sounds interesting to you as a fiction, but also as a kind of thought experiment, as the world's biggest thought experiment, narrative fiction thing, and open up a whole different way of working together. If any of this is even vaguely interesting to you, then that's why you're watching. But if it's not, you wouldn't have watched this, so people wouldn't have given it to you. So yeah, I hope you enjoy the fiction. And for those people that are not really that interested in fiction but wanted to know this in order to see how it fits with the other stuff, I hope I've fleshed it out sufficiently. Maybe give it a go, give it one of these things we're reading, and then start saying, oh, wait a minute. The writing style makes sense now because it's written in a certain way that is actually to do with me being present as I read it. And there'll be certain levels of the text that now start to make more sense. And if you happen to be exploring this already, or if this just sounds interesting to you, then take part. And I encourage you to do so, whether you do it within Urb or anywhere else. All right. Thank you very much. Thank you for your attention, and be well.